Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to direct this debate in this manner. I want to bring in a neutral perspective, especially in the area of economics. And I would like to call Mr. Ayanda Meiwa, because I think Mr. Meiwa is bringing a very neutral perspective around the outlook. So I'll allow you, Mr. Meiwa, to just bring in that perspective to direct our to direct our debate. And may I ask, ladies and gentlemen, our debate is heating up and it will get hot. So restraint, please exercise restraint. Interjections, let's keep that to a minimum. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to greet you all, and because of time constraints, just say all protocols observed. When I came, I was under the impression that I will sort of open up just to lay that neutral perspective. And so I'm presenting a PowerPoint, which will be very brief, I promise you. And it is called Economic Perspectives of South African Politics Pre and Post 1994. So what we're looking at is the consequences of apartheid on RSA and SA youth. I'm aware that because of the different political rhetoric and also schools of thought that we're exposed to, we may think we have a neutral perspective that is fairly objective. I'm also coming with that angle that mine is fairly neutral, as I'm not representing any political party or organization. There are words that are sang by James Blunt, who is a UK singer. He says, shine on, wear your smile just as bright as the sun, because they are all just slaves to the gods they've made. But you and I just shone, and just shone. Shine on, close your eyes and they'll all be gone. They can scream and shout that they've been sold out, but it paid for the cloud that we are dancing on. Now, I believe the reason we are having such an interesting topic as was Mandela's sellout is because genuinely some of the youth, if not the majority of black youth, are feeling that they've been let down by this new dispensation of democracy. Like, did we put people into power? I'm not talking about the ANC, but I'm talking about leadership. Did we elect our leadership into power, and have they betrayed the cause for which we believe they fought? So allow me to start with just a very brief historical perspective on our economy. Under apartheid, South Africa was a capitalist economy with a fascist body politic. The UK and the USA did support apartheid precisely because they felt it is a capitalist economy and they are unequivocally against communism. And so they'd better do what they can in order to support it. On the other hand, the now defunct Soviet states of Russia was for communism, and the popular rhetoric in the liberation movement was that of communism. And so they did support the political parties, or should I say the liberation movements, which back at that time were banned and they were not allowed to actually voice their opinions or even their convictions publicly. So because the USSR did support the ideology to which they also held, what happened was they would support the ANC and other movements. However, as we know that under apartheid, the black life didn't matter as much as other races. In fact, if there were any hierarchy, it would be the whites, Indians, coloreds, and right at the bottom of the pile, the blacks. And so even in industry, a black man's wages were 10 times less than that of a white man's wage, even if they have the same job. Now, since money speaks and money is neutral, it recognizes no race, the productivity of the black man, which would often exceed the productivity of the white person, was actually more favored by the Afrikaner capitalist. And so it happened that they started hiring more and more black people, which were 10 times cheaper for that same job, and that did not sit very well with the apartheid government. So internally, there were those pressures that business is not doing too well if we adhere to a certain quota that was set by the government of so many white people versus so many black people in different structures in terms of employment. But before that time, in 1959, the then leader of the ANC appealed to the international community to actually impose sanctions on South Africa so that apartheid would actually lose its economic grip on the country. We must understand that at the time, apartheid was funded largely through external funding. The capitalist businesses were depending heavily on external investments and FDIs. So during 1961 and 1962, the UN actually called for the sanctions to be imposed, but because these sanctions were to be imposed by predominantly the West, which was supporting capitalism, there was virtually no response from the West to actually do that. In the 1970s, there were two oil price shocks that made business very difficult, first in 1973 and also in 1979. And this proved difficult for South Africa as well. Now, because of the internal pressures that I mentioned, among many acts that actually placed restrictions on the number of blacks who could be employed in manufacturing industry was the Environmental Planning Act, which made business for the Afrikaner capitalists very difficult to actually conduct. And so they started even internally boycotting some of the laws, not apartheid as a system, but some of the laws that actually upheld it. And then there was a second price shock. By the early 1980s, the UN did review and they actually saw that there was virtually no response from the West in terms of imposing sanctions, and it moved the international community again to actually impose more sanctions. But because of business interests, what happened was the international community, your US, your UK, and the greater Europe, they came and they said, okay, very well, maybe we can negotiate with the leadership. And so what happened then was they did say, okay, let us hear an international declaration on the political position of the then ruling party, which was the National Party. To cut the long story short, what happened was an address in 1985 by P.W. Botha, the then president, and he made in his speech no intention of relinquishing political power to black people. One of the reasons he mentioned was, first of all, we may be the Afrikaners and therefore the minority, but who's to say that the blacks are not also a minority? And the reason he used was our linguistic and cultural diversity. He said, to whom shall we give power then? To the Basutus, to the Tswanas, to the Zulus, to whom? So it is better that, so far the economy is doing very well, let us remain with political power. After this time, the civil upheavals, which were orchestrated by the liberation movement internally, they got worse, and by November at that year, sanctions started being imposed. Among others was the reduction in the FDIs and also in investment by international business. And in South Africa, there were more struggles to which the government, unfortunately, responded very violently to as well. In 1989, the Soviet Union fell, and what happened was, because the Soviet Union fell, this is the defense that is not common opinion, but the defense that was given by F.W. de Klerk, who was president from 1989, he said, well, it is easy now to actually allow or unban ANC and other liberation movements because they see that communism is not working and it is an impractical solution, so there's really no threat towards making them more vocal. In 1990, as a move to actually show favor with the international community, Dr. Nelson Mandela was released. I would like to just now, with the few minutes that I have, literally a minute that I have left, actually portray the South African economy as an unexploded bomb in the early 90s, precisely because we know, because of all the restrictions that were imposed, among them the movements within the country and socially, many people were not included in the statistics of unemployment, of poverty, and of social, or as beneficiaries of social services. So everything looked very rosy for South Africa. But as soon as we gained our independence from apartheid, what happened was more people started being available. And what happened was at length, the capacity of the economy could not accommodate everyone and anyone. And it appeared that unemployment was soaring. But unemployment was actually a problem even way before 1994. It's just that it could not be put into the statistical publications. So why are we angry? Or why are the nations so angry? It is precisely because people are feeling generally let down. There's so much I skipped because it was a 15-minute presentation. It had to be contracted to 10.
Thank you, Mr. Meiwa. Can I now allow Ms. Nicole to come through and have your fair share of 10 minutes? Can we give you a round of applause? Okay.
You're going to leave that there?
Yeah, I'll start it. Go for it.
Thanks. Thanks, Mzola, and thank you to the Afri-ESM movement for hosting us today. I was told initially by some colleagues of mine that Mbuyiseni and Dlozi would be here, so I cleared my schedule and I made plans to be here. Then all I got was Jackie. So there's a bay deficit in the house, but. I think the question before us today has been discussed at some length by various contributors, and I tweeted about it a couple of days ago, and a very excited gentleman called, I think his name was David Mokwena, tweeted me about 15 times because he was most outraged by the topic. He said, "What kind of useless question is this? You are all useless sellouts. How and why does such a thing come to exist? All of your points are Mickey Mouse nonsense." And there was about 15 tweets of that. So David Mokwena was not of the view that we should be having this debate. But I am. I think that the question itself is quite narrow, but I think we can expand upon it, and there's a lot of questions within this that we as young people need to address. Most specifically, what is our inheritance as young South Africans from the negotiation process and from the transition to democracy? What has gone wrong and what has gone right with this country that we are now living in? And what do political parties and political structures offer as solutions for young people? I think that often young people, we let ourselves down in politics because we are too focused on partisan political divisions and not focused enough on what some of the common goals and outcomes should be. And I hope as we move into the next local government elections, more platforms like this will exist for us as young people to explore what it is we require from the various structures that are meant to serve us. Because we get very caught up in the political rhetoric and our different political parties and the loyalties and allegiances we have. But if we as young people aren't addressing the problems of youth in our own organizations to the detriment of political party loyalty that sometimes becomes so important, then we're doing all of ourselves a disservice. I also want to acknowledge, before I unpack the idea a little bit around Madiba and what the legacy is, that the biggest failure, I think, from the negotiations process I'll discuss in a minute, and from the Constitutional Assembly and the new country, in the new democracy, is that we haven't properly addressed the question of racism. And this is something I say all the time, that the average member of the South African minority groups, particularly whites, coloureds and Indians, I don't think appreciate fully the gravity of apartheid, how much apartheid disenfranchised people and disempowered people, and the horrors that we still see in people's lives, from that process. And it's something that I think that needs to become part of a more important national conversation, how we address privilege, how we address racism, and I think that that's one of the things that wasn't properly addressed in the process that is still with us today. And how we go about addressing that is another set of circumstances. But I think any young white person or Indian person or even coloured person in this country who doesn't recognise their own privilege, who doesn't recognise a set of circumstances in their life that exist because of their skin colour, is doing us all a disservice. And I think that's something that we need to discuss, and as white people, as minority groups, something that we need to be more fastidious about addressing. The question, my answer fundamentally to the question is quite obviously no. I think the CODESA process and the process of the constitutional assemblies was a very tough and fraught process that included a lot of violence, a lot of loss of life across all parties, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal, where we were worst affected in the hostels of Gauteng. And it was a process that took place under huge strain because we had the whole world watching and there was all this pressure on the political leaders. But I think I must echo the sentiments that were espoused by Jackie and Manda, that to focus on Mandela as the sole voice of the ANC is completely incorrect, particularly in the negotiations process. While I have no doubt he was intricately involved, there were many other people, most notably Cyril Ramaphosa, who headed up those negotiations on behalf of the ANC. So to characterize this as Mandela's choice, Mandela's legacy to us, I think is problematic in some sense. What is our inheritance from those processes? Our inheritance is a democracy that entails political freedom, okay? And I know the economic aspect of that is something that can be debated at length, but we have political freedom and a democracy in this country. We have a foundation for strong institutions that have since developed, and a foundation for a strong judiciary that, although it has its issues, is still strong in respect. And there's a quote from Mandela himself in 1995 that says, "We are not yet free. We merely have achieved the freedom to be free." And I think that that's something that's really important, because CODESA and the end of apartheid wasn't meant to be the solution. It was meant to be the beginning of a solution that was to be carried through to create the kind of society you all wanted to see. So anyone who thought in 1994 that we had a solution, everything was solved, was definitely a little bit too optimistic. And I think Mandela himself was probably a little bit too optimistic. We have a Bill of Rights in this country that is exemplary. And fundamental human rights are a package deal. You can't take some human rights and dissect them as you go and still expect the ones you like to stand. And that's something we often forget in this country, that human rights are fundamental and that human rights can't be disbanded to suit particular political agendas. I'm then going to go on to something that's a little bit more controversial, to say that I don't believe Madiba was the sellout. I believe the government that we have inherited from those processes, the government that is currently in place, is the one that has sold young people out. It's the one that has sold South Africans out, particularly black South Africans who are worse affected by the poverty that's so pervasive in this country. I'm going to unpack a few key issues. I've only got a few minutes left. But to look specifically at the issue of education. In this last financial year that's just concluded, 650 million rand of unused NSFAS funds were sent back to the National Treasury. 650 million rand. When we have a huge crisis of people not being able to access tertiary education, all this money is being left aside because there isn't proper implementation, the systems aren't refined, and there isn't proper support to students. There are also students, and I'm sure you all know because you're students and you deal with this kind of issue commonly, there are students in a gap who don't qualify for NSFAS funding, if the DA proposes we raise that ceiling to allow more of this money to come into play for students who most desperately need it. The Statistician General last week made some comments that black and coloured graduates are far less likely to get jobs after graduation than white and Indian graduates. And that's a reality of our time. It's something that needs to be sufficiently addressed and needs to be dismantled if we are to enable a prosperous society. I want to comment a little bit on land because I know that's a big focus on what we're talking about today. And at CODESA, one of the inheritances of the New South Africa was that 30% of commercial farming land, viable commercial farming land in this country, should be transferred to black farmers within 5 years, and within 10 years, the land redistribution process needs to be finalized. Now, that was perhaps a little bit ambitious, and we know that that definitely hasn't happened. But by and large, the ANC's land reform processes have failed. We have farmers who have been given land without given the correct support to make that land viable. We have over 100 million rand of illegal or fraudulent claims due to the issues in the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform. And we have a lot of fraud and corruption around this process and incredibly slow administrative processes. So I think we can all agree, and this is the one time I might be able to agree with Jackie, is that there's definitely been a failure on behalf of the ANC to properly address the land question. And I think that it's a moral imperative in this country that we address the land question, but we have to do it in a way that protects the poorest of the poor, that is done to promote proper administration and clean governance, that improves security of tenure for communal land dwellers, which has largely been unaddressed, and that we speed up the process and provide the support for land claimants to make their land economically viable, to protect food security, and which ultimately affects the poorest of the poor, as we've seen in the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. So I'll leave it there for now, and hopefully we'll have a bit more engagement later. But I think in conclusion, Mandela did what was necessary at the time, coupled with the ANC, to protect peace, to forge a democracy that had been so hard won, and to ultimately stop the country from ending in a civil war, which was very nearly the case on more than one occasion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Tobani Zigalala, can I hand it over to you, sir?
Greetings, sons and daughters of this country currently called the Republic of South Africa. I greet you, black people of Bigo. I greet you, Africans of Sobugo. Future citizens of a country called the Socialist Republic of Azania. I stand in front of you today to look at this question of was Nelson Mandela a sellout or not? And if he was a sellout, then how will it serve this current generation of black children? We need to look at this question very frankly, black people, because it becomes a problem when these questions become prominent at some time because some people have traveled and boarded a plane and were in meetings under confidential rules, and they come out and they vilify our leaders. It becomes a problem. It becomes a problem also, my people, when white monopoly capital creates these black saints, black messiahs that they put in the podium, and then when they feel the time is right, they force us to remove these black messiahs. It becomes a problem, my people. But if we look at Nelson Mandela, we also need to look at Nelson Mandela and maybe divide him into three personas that he has portrayed to us. We look at Nelson Mandela as the revolutionary who joined the ANC, formed the ANC Youth League with the great leaders of their generation. We must also look at Nelson Mandela, the prisoner who went to prison, who was charged with prison and given life imprisonment. We need to look at that person who at some time was in isolation, We need to look at that person who refused what we call conditional releases from the apartheid government. We need also to look at the man who was then in the association, who then became the chief negotiator at the time. We need to look at the person who, acknowledging that he doesn't have the capacity, nor the leadership position, to push the African National Congress into negotiations, did so nevertheless. We need to look at that person and look at that position and look at whether that decision was right or wrong. Because when we are going to dissect this problem, it becomes important for us to know what we are looking at. Now, it's becoming very clear, people, that Nelson Mandela, a revolutionary, goes to prison. Well, let's look at him before he goes to prison. Nelson Mandela, who joined the ANC in 1994, who formed the ANC Youth League in 1994, who militarized, radicalized the ANC. Right? 1944, he founds the ANC with the opium dars of this generation. He radicalizes, he militarizes the ANC. He becomes volunteer in the 52 of the Defiance Campaign. In 1955, he becomes weakened by this Freedom Charter sellout document that has become the Bible of the Revolution. We need to make clear that position, that the Freedom Charter itself becomes a sellout document of the ANC. Therefore, if we are going to separate Mandela from the ANC, it becomes a problem. If the Mandela sold out, then the ANC themselves sold out. So that's what needs to be clear. Now that's the Nelson Mandela, the revolutionary. Now Mandela goes to prison, right? He starts negotiations. He starts negotiations being mindful of the fact even his comrades in prison didn't agree with his position of starting to speak with the government. But he started negotiations nevertheless. He started these conversations alone. The eminent persons group, they visit him. The white journalists of the West, they visit him. White monopoly capital visit him. He's allowed these visits by the government. Now we need to ask ourselves a question. Why was he allowed? Maybe that question will answer it one day. Why did the government of the country move him away from Robben Island, put him at Cosmo, put him in isolation, then allow the West to visit him and have a conversation with him? So all those questions we need to ask ourselves. We must know who we are dealing with. But maybe it will not help us to sit here and ponder out the question of whether Mandela was a sellout or not. Because if we ponder on that question any longer, white monopoly capital, which has created and raised these black messiahs, will raise another one for us. And black people, let me tell you a fact. Right now, I think I'm going to tell you a fact. I don't know if you're going to agree with it. But there is no black person, there is no person who's going to come from either the heaven or from underground and liberate the black masses. The black masses themselves will liberate themselves. So if we're going to allow white monopoly capital to create these symbols, idols that they've created for us, because the problem with white monopoly capital is that sometimes they become very scared when these leaders themselves have become above who they are. They then try to remove these people because now they are scared of the symbol that they've created. Maybe that's what they are doing with the legacy of Mandela. We don't know. They will tell us one day. But black people, it must be very clear. I don't know. There was a gentleman who was standing here, and he talked about the land question. And then he told us that the land question is not fundamental to our struggle. It became problematic. Because Nelson Mandela, who joined the ANC, he says, I joined the ANC after being inspired by the stories, the folklore was told by my people, my leaders and my elders. I joined the ANC because they told me about Bambata, Kamanzinza, Dingani, Kasenza Nakon, who was fighting for the land. I said to myself, it would be good for me as a black person to also join this struggle and fight for the land. So if we are going to say the African National Congress was not founded because the land of the African majority was stolen away, if we look at the foundation of the ANC, we must also look at 1911 and 1913. Look at those dynamics, and then tell me if it's not about the land. But black people, as I come to conclusion, let us not distract ourselves. We must know who our enemy is. We must know who our friends are. I'm gonna make this maybe using Malcolm X plantation analysis. In a plantation, there's a house nigger, there's a field nigger, there's a master. You don't fight the house nigger because it's got proximity to whiteness. Who becomes the problem in the plantation? It's the master himself. So if I'm going to start a fight today as a black person, the fight for my freedom doesn't go to the house nigger because he doesn't have the power to free me. My freedom rests with the master who owns the plantation. So as black people, we need to be clear. We need to be clear. And when we talk about white monopoly capital, I know some people will say, hey, black consciousness adherents are racist, it's reverse racism and whatnot. I will tell you this very clear thing. If my problem in society is created by race, why will I use another thing to solve it? Because my problem is created by race, I will solve it using race. It is clear. In closing, as I conclude, black people, as I conclude, black people, it becomes very clear too. It becomes very clear too that if I say my problem is created by the race, then some people will say, no, you are being racist. Well, I think that question you already answered it about black people and racism. We do not need to go back there. But for me, personally, I struggle to understand the people who talk about the black consciousness philosophy, the Pan-Africanist philosophy, as being reverse racism towards white people. I struggle to understand where did they come from with this thing. Because how is it that when I love myself, I self-define myself, I self-affirm myself, I tell myself that whatever the system tells me,